And so one of the things that keeps flipping back and forth is that a new Democratic administration comes in and imposes these project labor agreements on all of their big construction programs, which is basically, if you're going to get a deal with us to build something, you got to make a deal with your local union. And the Biden administration was just wild with this. The project labor agreements, the PLAs as they're known, we're just everywhere. And the federal government has $750 billion a year that it contracts out. This is the GDP of many, not even small countries, of large countries, go through the federal government contracting. And Biden set a rule that 15% of this had to go through minority-owned businesses. We're talking well over $100 billion a year in this program that's a pure type of racial favoritism.
I'm Dr. Randy Bach, and I'm honored today to have with us, you and me, Judge Glock. He is the Director of Research at the Manhattan Institute, which produces the City Journal and is the home of luminaries such as Theodore Dalrymple, a.k.a. Anthony Daniels, and Heather MacDonald, and many others. Here he is. Judge Glock just wrote in the Wall Street Journal, I'll see if I can come up with the title. Maybe he can come up with it faster than I can. But he has an op-ed piece. Make the U.S. civil service effective again. So I don't know if I can get that on a hat. M-U-C, whatever. So it looks like mucus or something like that. But so how can we make the civil service great again? Was it ever?
Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me on. The question of whether it was great, I think, is an open one. But I think most people would agree it certainly was more effective in the past. And one of the reasons that we go into in this report is the increase in procedures around removals that make it much more difficult today than in the past to remove poorly performing workers and so forth. But one of the surprising things that we tried to highlight in the report is that there's a lot of states that have actually gone back and kind of reformed their civil service to remove these removal protections that states like Georgia, Kansas, Arizona, Texas have basically most, if not all, of their employees at will, meaning they can be removed just like a private sector worker without going through the usual government rigmarole of a separate outside body and special procedures and performance improvement plans dictated by law, et cetera, et cetera. So these states show what can change. And in those states that have changed, they seem to work pretty well. The managers seem more happy there than in other states. There's general reports of improved performance and retention. So I think the federal civil service can learn a lot from the states that have made substantive change.
Yeah, well, the question is whether the civil service themselves would want that or whether somebody managing it.
It's certainly that's an open question as well, I would say. But, the surprising thing is these surveys that have done of civil servants. Because it's really tough to measure the effectiveness of government workers, often surveys are all we can do. But they do show these things like improved retention and performance, which is good. I mean, a lot of civil servants everywhere know of that guy who's down the hall, who hasn't worked in 5 years and they just can't remove, and yet they have to pick up the pace for him. So even if a lot of civil servants wouldn't be thrilled with a complete at-will removal system, I think most of them would agree the current system.
You basically get a better esprit de corps, joie de vivre, and some other French words. The irony is that the French don't have this, despite having esprit de corps and joie de vivre. In France, it's like, whether it's public or private, I think it's almost impossible to fire somebody. I saw a recent little blob diagram. It wasn't a Venn diagram, but these blobs that showed like the market cap of companies, startups brought in the U.S., the largest ones versus elsewhere in the world. And the U.S. has all the bigger blobs, and the EU has just a couple tiny ones. And this is again private sector stuff, but the difference is what? Well, in the EU, it's like, it's sclerotic. You hire somebody. And then you can't get rid of them. It's almost like marriage, and marriage can be wonderful, but it has to be like a different process, and there's clearly a lot more at stake and so forth. but you don't want to marry every single employee. As a former employer myself, I ran a medical office. There's a lot of stuff going on. You can't just do a full deep dive in every single employee. 85-90% of the time, your instincts are right, say, or that person's good, or both, and so forth. But every now and then, somebody doesn't work out. It's not working out for you. It's not working out for them, and things can't go on. And you wind up having a kind of a different process, and it changes the tenor of the office. Again, without doing the medical thing too much, but I know a lot of other doctors, and most of them are unhappy because they work in these big settings and they have no control over the people there. And so there's very little responsiveness, hiring and firing, there's unions and whatnot. And so they just feel like they're just another cog in this machine that's not working. It might very well help the civil service to feel like there's something there and they're part of something, like on a winning team as opposed to a losing team.
Yeah, well, some of the reform analyses that have happened in these states and even in some of these federal agencies that have kind of experimented with what's known as radical civil service reform have shown where you do have more people leaving the service, but the leavers tend to be lower performing people. The people who stay are the high performers, and that's frankly what you want. You want the high performers to feel comfortable in the civil service, and I think right now a lot are genuinely discouraged because they have to quote unquote compete with the guy down the hall who hasn't worked in 2 to 5 years and just kicking up his legs waiting for the pension. So, I think there is a demand, at least somewhat, inside the civil service for some sort of reform. And now, again, obviously, they're not going to be ecstatic about a complete at will. But as I show, by most measures in the states, this has worked very well, hasn't led to mass politicization, hasn't led to these absolute changes in the workforce every time a new administration comes in. It's been kind of on the margin, but the margins have been positive.
Yeah. So there's the article there. People can find it and read it. It's a good piece. It's hard. I mean, I was just looking at the states there. Was there a non-Republican state that has done this?
Well, actually, the first state to really do modern civil service reform, what's known as radical civil service reform, was Georgia when it was a Democratic state. It was a Democratic Governor Zell Miller down in 1996 in Georgia who said at this point the civil service is no longer the solution, it's the problem. And this was kind of a little bit evocative maybe of Reagan's, the government isn't always the solution, it's the problem. And he correctly pointed out, along with many of his Democratic colleagues, that the system was sclerotic. It wasn't responding to needs. It was allowing poor performers to continue on indefinitely. I think one of the state legislators piled a big pile of papers, I want to say like 1,000 pages long, that had needed to be accumulated to fire a single worker. That's what was happening in these states. And a lot of states that back in the 90s at least had more moderate Democrats that wanted government to work, they were pushing on this. Bill Clinton, in fact, convened a commission on reforming the civil service in the state and local governments, where they said you should do a lot of these sorts of reforms. So at least in the early years, there were some more Democratic states who took these steps. Now, a lot of the more modern reforms to the civil service happened after the 2010 Republican victories in the state elections and onwards, where they captured a lot of these formerly Democratic states and kept them. And those have done some of the most contemporary and radical civil service reform in recent years.
Yeah. So I was just writing, I've got an article up on Brownstone. It's covers this topic a little bit. I mean, the actual title is it rolls off the tongue. Aspirin BARDA, bureaucratic dysfunction and biodefense. So that's not easy. It probably tongue twister a little bit. It's got our friend Anthony Fauci there, part of the civil service, and how he kind of doubled his salary by taking on another agency for the Defense Department. But I actually bring up, I gleaned a lot of this from Dr. Robert Malone. And he talks about this, the senior executive service and regulatory burdens. I don't know whether this can be undone except through Congress, but it started with the assassination of President Garfield, which was not yesterday, but a while ago. And the concept there was that he should have some legacy because he got elected, so his people should stick around. Otherwise, you could assassinate somebody and get rid of the ethos of his being, his concepts and whatnot. So they wanted to like have some glue for the civil service, and it was supposed to be probably just a handful of directors and whatnot agencies, so that Garfield's concepts could outlive Garfield if you shot Garfield or the next president. And then it kind of got turbocharged 100 years later by Jimmy Carter, and then it got turbocharged by Obama, um, and it became, now there are thousands, there are 6,000 or 7,000 SES levels who can't be fired in the federal government. I don't know if you follow that at all, or have any thoughts about kind of these sinecures that people have carved out in our systems.
Well, so yeah, the senior executive service was a sense was trying to be the answer to the problem of how bad the civil service had gotten in the 1970s. And so there's a great book by political scientist Hugh Hecklow called A Government of Strangers that looked at the fact that there wasn't in the US civil service, like there was in a lot of other countries, this kind of breed of elite civil servants who crossed different departments, who could be transferred from a health department to a security department to a defense department, and would know the general rungs of the government, but would be sort of skilled in the nature of budgets and accounting and legal processes and so forth. And the senior executive service was supposed to answer to that need. And as you point out, it didn't quite work out like that. That service still does have some interesting aspects. It's still a little more flexible on pay. You still can actually reward senior executive civil servants a little more for doing a good job than you can your typical federal employee, where it's just a step system. The longer you sit in your desk, the more you get paid, and that's pretty much a 1-to-1 correlation. So, the senior executive service is, in some sense, it was a promising idea that just never got implemented in practice. And that went for a lot of that 1978 Civil Service Reform Act that you mentioned that came out of Jimmy Carter's presidency. That was supposed to be taking care of all of these problems that everybody admitted had arisen in the civil service. Too slow to fire, too difficult to move people around, too difficult to hire. And what that actually did is, because the unions pretty much got a hold of it, the federal employee unions, they turned into the opposite of what a lot of the people pushing that act thought it should be. And we now have some oral histories, some interviews with people who worked on that. And they admitted that, yeah, the public rhetoric at the time was, oh, it's impossible to fire people. You have to do, go all through this rigmarole and this intense process. And we're reforming that in this act. And then the people actually working in the act who knew the jot and tittle about the actual words in it said, that was all crap. Like, we knew that's not what the act was doing. That's what the rhetoric was about the act. But we knew this was actually doing, most importantly, actually making sure the federal employee unions had a permanent place in the federal government. Before then, federal employee unions really didn't have legal negotiating authority. But that act was the first one that set up the Federal Labor Relations Authority, the first time you have this government body that's supposed to mediate between the taxpayer and the government and these unions, and actually gave these government unions a say in what were known as conditions of employment. So that act is really unfortunate in a lot of levels, because Jimmy Carter himself recognized the problems. You had a lot of people willing to make reforms, but they kind of got hoodwinked by these other people who knew the game better and actually turned the act into the opposite of what it was supposed to be.
Right. Now, humans are gamers, and if they can take the rules and turn them upside down. One of my sort of favorite basketball players is James Harden, and he's good. He's got his own way. I don't think he's the most athletic guy there, but he's clever, and he plays to the rules. So he can get more points at the free throw line than from shooting. So if he can make you foul, so he does everything to kind of get to the edge of the rules. And I think people do that in general whenever they can. And if the rules are such that you're protected from bad work, then you will do as little work as possible. And if that's not the case, if you see people kind of contravening that, then you'll try to squeeze them. So just one quick anecdote. I used to treat in a blue collar town, and I had a lot of postal worker, police, fire employee as patients. And when they were new, they'd get on the job and they were gung ho. Like, one guy was a postal mail carrier, and he came and he was like really upset. It's like, I do my route in an hour and a half. And they got really angry at me I'm like, why? It's like, well, because it's an 8-hour route. It's like, well, what do you mean? You did an hour and a half. It's like, yeah. I came back. I looked for more work, and they're like, you're going to ruin it for everybody. That is an eight. They told them that's an 8-hour route. 8 hours. Make it eight. Make it 8 hours. Whatever you have to do. Sleep in the car. Whatever. And so now, he became disconsolate, and police officers who saw crime and were kind of kept away from it. So here's the question. Bill Clinton back in the day. I'm old enough. You're probably not. His favorite guy, I guess, his advisor was this David Osborne, who wrote Reinventing Government. And the concept there was that all these things are on the wrong sum. If you have a private, like Amazon wants to get more customers. They want to sell more stuff. The police department wants to do as little as possible. And if they got rid of crime, then you might not need as many policemen in your mind. If you got rid of fires, you might not need firemen. So they don't want to put themselves out of a job. They have this kind of like a different pull that would, if they did their jobs effectively, 100% effective, you may not never need them again. If I have a pest control guy, he gets rid of all my pests, I might keep him for a year or two, but then I'll wait 10 years before I rehire somebody. How do you deal? Supposedly Clinton was going to try to do this where they get incentives for getting rid of the problem they're supposed to address, but that doesn't seem actually to be the case. Has that been endemic through government, and what are the fixes possible?
Yeah, I think on one level that everybody should be somewhat cautious about the chances for radically reforming government workers and the government program, precisely because it's still always going to be government. There's never going to be a world where government and government workers are going to be motivated by the same incentive structure, the same sort of competition that people in the private sector are motivated by, and that helps the private sector outcompete the government whenever they're set head to head. I mean, but there are a lot of things they can do, and Clinton was alluding to those things in the 1990s. Yes, his Reinventing Government initiative was part and parcel of this reform that was happening in the states that were looking at reforming civil service. Now, Philip Howard, who wrote The Death of Common Sense, who is also very much in this kind of new Democrat reformist mindset, was also one of the inspirations for Georgia reforming its civil service. The governor there, again, Governor Zell Miller, said he read Howard's book, The Death of Common Sense, and said, "Oh, wait, this is the problem. We need to blow up this civil service system," and he did. So there are these ways to push it, and actually, on the margins at least, make it more efficient. Allow managers to remove people that are bad, et cetera, et cetera. And like I said, this has happened now in several states. I wouldn't put an exact number on it, but you've had reforms to the removal process, the discipline process. You've had reforms to hiring. Historically, you had a very stodgy system where basically people sat in a room and they took a civil service test, and it didn't really matter if you were a custodian or if you were a doctor. You took these little civil service tests and you got slotted into your job, and they weren't very appropriate for the job you were doing. Now, there certainly would be some room for a new civil service test or types of civil service tests in the federal government that unfortunately were basically ended due to lawsuits about racial disparities in the early 1980s. And I think there's some options that should be taken to bring these tests back. But what we shouldn't do, which I think unfortunately some conservatives are advocating for, is return to that testing system, because that's precisely what these reform states also got away from. In the private sector, if you want a job, you don't all sit in a room and take a test with a formal score, and the top 3 people with the best scores in the civil service test, they get hired, and the person with number 4 doesn't get hired. That's not where we want to go back to. The positive thing that's happened to some extent in the federal government, most especially in the states, is allow managers discretion about who to hire, which is in Texas, by one report, you could have a manager who talks to someone at a coffee shop and says, "Hey, wait, you're exactly who I'm looking for. Would you want to work for me at the Department of Transportation and help build a highway?" And the person could say, "Yeah." And you can hire them just like in a private sector job. The federal government, even though they don't have the same stodgy tests, still has a much too formalized process. David Shulkin, who was a healthcare executive who worked in the Veterans Administration under both Obama and Trump in the first term, talked about how hard it was, where he would try to hire other healthcare executives who he knew were top in the field to run the Veterans Administration or Veterans Affairs health care system, and he would give them into the hiring system, and they would compete against a bunch of people who had no healthcare experience, who didn't know about hospitals, and for whatever reason, the human resource professionals in the federal government would rate these other guys who worked at, say, the Federal Aviation Administration tops, and this best in country healthcare executive wouldn't even get to the top of these lists. And Shulkin was pulling his hair out, saying, "This is insane. I know this guy is the one of the best healthcare executives in the country, and I can't recruit him because he has to go through this
Right.
formal
So
hiring
it's kind
process."
of the old concept that Albert Einstein literally couldn't get a physics job today because he doesn't have like a teaching certificate. I mean, he could probably teach it at Princeton like he did, sort of, but he couldn't teach physics in high school. Let's say he retired Einstein and he wants to, just hang out and teach at the high school. He cannot do that without a teaching certificate. So they have these standards that have nothing to do with the quality of your work. It's really just kind of a credentialing aspect. But the thing you're talking about cuts both ways. I mean, you want to have some measurements so people don't abuse the system and just go by I don't know, kind of like a kickback scheme where they hire people that are going to be dependent on them. So that's so the side question would be, um, you know, what's I know when they did the Obamacare website, the Affordable Care Act website, they spent gazillions, which is a technical term, and they got nothing. They got a crappy site and so forth. You know, why don't and why can't they just get out of the business of doing stuff and offload everything the way everybody else does? I mean, I run a government. Say I run my house. It looks like you have a house as well, based on the slope of the roof there. And I have employees. I have synecured like long-term employees. My son, they're adults now, but when they're younger, they're working for me ostensibly. I mean, I'm working for them, feeding them and all that stuff, paying their way. But I ask them to do something, mow the lawn. Okay. Now you get a job. You might get the job. You might get it done at some point if you hector enough. But it's not going to be as good as if I paid somebody to mow the lawn. And it might be overall less grief to hire some other kid. Frankly, I could hire the kid across the street. He'd mow the lawn, and they across the street they could hire my kid. It would work out better for both of us because we don't have that familial obligation. I'm not stuck with that person. It seems like a lot of stuff that's going to get in-house done is almost like having your family do your work, which is okay, but it's not the same as having employees or
Yeah,
having somebody who's fireable.
no, I agree. And so, but I think there's two sides of this that are crucial to consider. Now, one, in general, I think most of what the federal government, and especially the state and local governments, do can be hired out to somebody else. And there's just an abundance of evidence that it's more efficient. Like, we just have zero doubts about cost per highway mile, cost for constructing a new school, cost for operating a bus system. The general rule of thumb is it's about a fourth to a third cheaper if you run with the private sector and contract it out versus doing it in-house inside the government. That's just a good, just kind of back of the envelope. If you had to guess how much cheaper it's going to be, say a fourth to a third cheaper. Big savings from doing this. But so this gets to the separate issue of, if the government is going to hire it out, they need to have an appropriate contracting system. And this has also been one of my obsessions that I don't think get the attention it deserves, even with this recent discussion in DOGE and civil service reform. It's like, well, how do we contract something out? How do we decide the contract for repaving a road, for building a new HHS building in DC, et cetera? Now, I think it's a similar problem in the contracting or procurement system as it is in the civil service system, and that the general issue in government is everyone's assumed to be guilty until proven innocent. And therefore, the system sets up very rigid rules about who you can talk to, who you can contract with, how the contracting process is supposed to go. And similar to the civil service system, the assumption is, oh, if you allow people to contract out with whomever, they'll just reward their friends and they'll give it the contract to their best buddy. And again, I'm sure that will happen. But in general, the issue is, are you going to give some people some discretion to do what you think is best? You give them a mission and then give them the discretion to accomplish that. Or are you going to say, here are 5,000 rules you have to follow, and let's hope in following those you can't possibly do anything wrong because you actually have no independent discretion whatsoever? And generally, the government takes that latter approach. They take, here are the sort of rules, and not only are those rules just destructive in terms of getting the best contractors for our tanks, for our roads, etc., they're not surprisingly also littered with a lot of political preferences. Now, one of the things I've written very extensively on is these minority contracting requirements in federal law, which are extensive and haven't gotten, to my mind, a tenth of the attention they deserve, and certainly much less than, say, affirmative action in universities or in hiring. But the federal government has $750 billion a year that it contracts out. This is the GDP of many, not even small countries, of large countries, go through the federal government contracting. And Biden set a rule that 15% of this had to go through minority owned businesses. Like, we're talking well over $100 billion a year in this program that's a pure type of racial favoritism. And you have laws that Congress set up, and as well, you have to check on the race and the disadvantaged background of these people before you offer a bridge contract, a highway, a tank, and so forth. And it's just a horrific scam on the taxpayers, and usually a scam inside the contracting world too. Because I talk to everybody in there, and they say, "Well, I don't do this, but I know 4 other contractors who hire a front man to pretend to be leading the company, so I can get the minority owned, so they can get the minority owned contracting bid, et cetera, et cetera." So those are the sort of thing we need to blow up. Even if we're in the privatized government zone, which I very much am, we need to reform these contracting rules so they can start hiring it out again. Because right now it's just a mess.
Yeah, there's a couple other layers of this. And from my article, I mean, this is kind of stuff I was uncovering here, but during Operation Warp Speed, one of the things they had to deal with was this cumbersome contract requirements. This is called the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and then they wound up using other transaction authorities, which are only for prototypes. This is not quite the same thing as what you're talking about, but there's a whole. What happens is that companies, if they want to deal with the FAR, kind of the standard regulations to be a contractor for the government, they kind of have to devote 40% of their workforce towards just deciphering, kind of like the Google Translate for these documents back and forth to deal with the government. Like, I have a microphone. It's kind of USB. We have all these internet, like USB. I could put my microphone in your computer, but vice versa. But with this thing, companies have to have this huge kind of, intermediary vessel or whatever of 40% of the workforce just to deal with all keeping track and checking all the right boxes for government. And conversely, the government gets the right to kind of do a systemic bureaucratic colonoscopy of the entire unit. So if Pfizer hired on to do some work for the government outside on the standard, all their emails between the vice president and the president are theoretically discoverable by the government. So they're like, we can't run our regular business and have confidentiality about our secret projects, whatever, drugs we don't want, competitive advantage and so forth. And so they won't do it. So what you're left with is kind of these like the after nuclear war, you get the cockroaches are supposedly the ones that are going to live. Just kind of these hardy little things that can do one thing well, which is deal with the government and make a single product, but not be really big or really efficient, really fast or anything like that. So the kind of the prototypes, I want to write a follow-up article on this Emergent Biosolutions, which is a company in the Beltway that houses our anthrax strategic stockpile, and smallpox, I guess, vaccine, and so forth. And they're the only ones that'll do it. And they're not necessarily the best pharma company. They tried to do a COVID vaccine and they totally failed. They have total issues on making stuff. We have no idea how good they are, but there's kind of this monopsony thing where they have a one-to-one relationship with these agencies I mentioned in biodefense. And that's the only one who's willing to put up with the grief and devote a huge fraction of its workforce towards just talking government ease. So is there any way to ease government ease?
Well, so this is, I didn't write about this in my recent report, but I've written a little bit about this elsewhere. This was another surprising side of the reinventing government movement that you talked about earlier that also never panned out as a lot of its proponents had hoped it would. So Steve Kellman, who was the head of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy during Bill Clinton's administration, also looked at kind of loosening these constraints, these fall on the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and allowing again kind of managers more discretion under the idea that, well, we can either write 10,000 rules for every federal manager or employee, or we can say, here's your job, you better accomplish it. The means you do, as long as they're legal, are up to you. And he allowed people a little more discretion to buy small purchases on a government credit card, which I think was a good thing. It led to some minor scandals later, and therefore was clamped down on. But that was exactly that's the nature of government. Usually, the kind of sine wave of government reform, in which you loosen something up a little bit, you have some minor scandal, and Congress and others say, well, the solution is to make rules 10 times as strict and increase oversight 10 times as much and make sure everybody reports everything in 700 page reports after they do it. And the end result is, yeah, you get zero scandals, but you can't actually buy or build anything whatsoever. So, I think there have been some reforms to that. Some things on some of these purely political reforms, such as the minority contracting that I mentioned, that's being subject to a lot of lawsuits on equal protection grounds right now in the wake of Harvard and the Students for Fair Admission. And so those might go the way of the dodo before too long if the Supreme Court gets a say about it. But some of these other ones are just going to take fights in Congress and in the administration. So one of the things that keeps flipping back and forth is that a new Democratic administration comes in and imposes these project labor agreements on all of their big construction programs, which is basically, if you're going to get a deal with us to build something, you got to make a deal with your local union. And the Biden administration was just wild with this. The project labor agreements, the PLAs as they're known, were just everywhere. And, Republican administrations have generally got rid of these. So they said, you're a contractor, here's the price, give us the service or good as quickly and as efficiently as you can. And, as long as you're obeying the private sector laws, you're going to be okay. But this is something I've joked about. A lot of people on the left today are part of this supply side progressive movement, this abundance movement, which I have a lot of sympathy for. And you can see it in a sense as maybe even another outgrowth of this earlier new Democrat movement of the 80s and the 1990s. But I often, try to think about, well, what exactly are you trying to accomplish with these sorts of reforms right here? And are you willing to actually take on what is the entirety of the Democratic constituency, the unions, the minority contracting groups, the environmentalists, all these other groups that are supposed to be kind of like barnacles attached to whatever the main project is, the highway, the transit system, the others. And, I don't see a lot of likelihood that's going to happen. And in fact, during the Biden administration, it was the opposite. You saw more mandates put on contracting than ever before. And not surprisingly, this is why we had just absolutely wild underperformance and underdeliverance on every.
No, it's no shock. It's no shock. As you were talking, I was thinking about my interactions with government. I mean, I ran my own practice, but it's inevitable that you're going to deal with government. I mean, I had to, I have patients with Medicare and state welfare and so forth, and some with both. And so you're dealing with all that kind of bureaucracy in order to get paid sometimes. I don't want to get into that. But the more interesting was my building was hit by a tornado, which don't really happen in Massachusetts, except for me, I guess. It was a rarity, 1 out of 150 years in the Northeast here, and whatever. So it was a big deal, and $1 million damage. We went through all that. But on the cleanup end, I was offered this, I don't know, something Good Cities project, I don't know, some federal granting to make your facades nicer. It had a nice little name like that, I don't know, Pretty Cities to rhyme. And so fine. So I got like $100,000 grant to do X, Y, and Z to make a new facade. But you had to do prevailing wage, which means that I had a guy, and when I do stuff, I'm pretty frugal. I get 3 bids probably for any job I do, and decide based on quality, price, whatever. But in this case, no matter whom you got, it would have to be a so-called, and mind you, the prevailing wage, not the actual prevailing wage. What it means is you're going to have to pay union rate for everything you do, and so the idea is that somebody in the union is not going to have any discompetitive advantage by virtue of his being actually discompetitive, whatever the word is, overpriced. And then there's all these kind of forms we had to do endlessly and so forth. And we eventually kind of squeezed the toothpaste out of that tube and the thing got built, but it would have been built better and more effectively, and our money would have gone twice as far in making the actual thing, supposedly nicer and whatever, if we'd been able to use the money effectively. And everything kind of has like a caveat. It's like, oh my God, such grief.
It is wild, and I've described this elsewhere as the problem of usually progressives, but not always, but usually progressives trying to use the state as kind of a policy vanguard in the sense of, or an avant-garde of that, like, listen, we can't mandate prevailing wages throughout the whole economy, but we can mandate it just on government projects. We can't mandate minority contracting requirements across the whole economy. We can do it on government. We can do affirmative action on government projects that require for jobs. We can't mandate certain environmental standards or reports on every private sector project, but we can do it on government. And so the irony is the left, in by incapable of imposing its sort of maximalist regulatory demands in the private sector, ends up imposing a lot of them just on the public sector, precisely the sector they want to be the effective one driving all of this change. And so you have a strange system where they say, oh, we can get the new policy we're aiming at on affirmative action, on labor, whatever it is, out the door by just mandating it in government. And what's the effect? You make most Americans more upset about government in general because they have 10 times as many mandates on them. Like, if that's abundance movement, the progressive supply siders really cared about this, they would say, one of the first line sentences, their first sort of standard should be no mandates on the public sector that aren't on the private sector. Like that, insofar as we have that, I think that's a good rule. I'd rather not have the mandates in the private sector either in general. But in general, there's no reason to say, well, this is bad for the private sector, but I think it's good for government to do it. There's no logic to that.
Right. So I want to talk on a kind of a more focal, local level. I guess most of us encounter government a lot, but on a regular daily basis, if we have kids, is in the schools. Obviously, there's private schools, parochial schools, public schools, and from my understanding, at least in Massachusetts, every town has unionized workforce for its school districts. Is that a national thing? How did that happen? How does one undo that? Is there a way to have schools contract employees directly? And what happens when you have kind of this workforce that doesn't necessarily have any reason to, follow your directives politically, as we've seen locally, through the woke kind of intersectional DEI, blah, blah, blah agenda being foisted?
Yeah. So similar to kind of these protections in the civil service against removal, the existence and power of public sector employee unions is relatively new. Now, they've existed at least since the 19th century, where you had groups of, in the federal government, it was the National Association of Letter Carriers, I believe was the name. A lot of the postal employees were unionized, but the government had no duty to negotiate with them. You can be a part of a union, but it's basically kind of a social club / collective benefit group where we pay funeral benefits for each other if somebody dies. It really wasn't until the 1960s that unions took off in the public sector. They took off in the private sector in the 1930s, but a lot of people, including President Franklin Roosevelt himself, said there's no reason the public sector should be unionized. The person on the other side of the negotiating desk isn't some, from their perspective, evil capitalist trying to grind the face of the poor. The opponent, so to speak, of the other side of the negotiating desk is the government, is the taxpayers. Why do you need a union?
Nice
Yeah, yeah, which ironically, it is government effectively negotiating on each side of the table. You have one sector of the government, the public employee union, negotiating with the other side, the managers and the taxpayers. And this took off in the 60s and 70s, and really had devastating effects on state and local government, and eventually, as I mentioned, in the 1970s, in the federal government, everywhere they set up. Right now, you have the strange situation where about half of all union employees are public sector, and about almost half of all union employees have a college degree. We have the conception of our mind still of the average union employee is a hard hat swinging a pickaxe in a coal mine somewhere. No, your average union worker right now is a college educated bureaucrat somewhere that is
when
making more.
did that get enshrined in law? And is there any way to unenshrine in law? And Was it the AFSCME or something like that?
Yeah,
Uh,
AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, which
isn't it the
uh,
biggest union on earth or something, or in the U.S.?
it's one of them. It's what dominates your state and local workforce outside of the schools, where
Weren't
it's
they going to
the
join the Teamsters too, or something?
well, the Teamster and a lot of other groups like Teamsters and Service Employees International Union have been making inroads into government because they've had problems in the private sector, precisely because if you're a union, you drive your company into the ground. The non-unionized company next door is going to do better, and you can't compete. But if you're a government employee union, your government is going to exist no matter how bad your union is. And so the unions recognize they could do to unionize a lot of these areas pretty well and stay unionized in them. So yeah, can it reform? Absolutely. So it is still only a third of all public sector employees are union, which is a lot. It's a lot, but it's a hell of a lot more than the 6% of the private sector that's unionized. Again, the union movement today is really public sector workers to a large extent. And in many states, you don't. Yes, to answer your question, you don't have them. In South Carolina, North Carolina, and actually just as about a month ago in Utah, collective bargaining with unions is banned across the state and local government. And you have a lot of states throughout the South that don't have formal and complete bans, but have partial bans that say often usually just police and firefighters, or often just some local employees can negotiate. And the evidence on this is about as clear as can be. The areas that don't have the unions have more efficient service. They have better school outcomes. We learned this actually from the Wisconsin Act 10, which Governor Walker passed in 2010 and 11, which after this ended collective bargaining for public employee unions in a lot of these places, school performance improved, especially for minority kids. Cost went way down. All of the good outcomes you'd want to happen happened. Now, a recent Wisconsin Supreme Court ruling has overturned a lot of that act on, to my mind, just entirely specious grounds. But yeah, the states and local governments show you can do this. You can fight this. The states and local governments didn't adopt this stuff until the 60s, and really that was only in the more left wing parts of in the urban areas, and not so much in the South. And in recent years, you've seen a lot more pushback against these public employee unions because people know they don't work, and it's a redistribution upwards. Your median union employee is not just earning more money; that they're a better educated, higher class individual than your average citizen or taxpayer. And so people are saying, "What? Why am I paying the person with a master's degree an extra amount of money so they can be more comfortable when I'm a hard hat swinging a hammer on a job site?" The last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up about this. I remember when I was a graduate student, I was forced to be part of the American Association of University Professors, a union there. It was legally required by the state of New Jersey when I was at Rutgers. And I was talking to my doctor, who was also part of some public sector employee union. And I was like, what world is this where professors and doctors are talking about their unions and their average citizen out in the street is paying the taxes for us? Like this is back. This is a union for the upper class, is
Yeah.
what's
I
happening these
think what
days.
happens is the monarchy might be the default position for humanity, or maybe the magnetic position that everything kind of like attracts back into it. I mean, back in say, Louis the 15th or 14th or 16th, whatever, they l'état c'est moi, they ruled by divine right and so forth. So they had a monarchy and they all had kinds of courts, and everyone got it. Like, oh, you're living like royalty because, well, you're royalty, and you've got partially the divine aspect, and everyone bowed down. But it seems like over time everything has kind of come to reassume that form. It's like one of those sci-fi movies where you kill the guy and then all his molecules kind of reglom together and he becomes that thing all over again. Like, I don't know, I'm going to misquote the movie, but um, any of your science fiction movie. But it seems like what happens is that this seems to be maybe not in our DNA per se, but in our social DNA. Kind of remap this thing where there's going to be some hierarchy. There's going to be a power because that's what that's how we are. Somebody has to protect you. You go farm. Somebody else does the protection. The people who does the protection, they want to be paid for whatever. So the people who have the guns and the power. Anyway, so there's always going to be this structure, the superstructure, and then it's going to corrupt. It's going to self-corrupt, and they're going to get whatever they can because that's what people do. They get what they can when they can. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and I don't know all the cycle. So it seems like an eternal battle to kind of get things to be efficient. Is that a wan, forlorn wish?
Yeah. Again, it's always a little bit in one direction and the other is how we should usually view these things. Again, I don't think government's going to all of a sudden turn into Amazon and have the mail delivered in minutes from after you send it somewhere else and put it in your package without even thinking about it. But can you make the postal service a little more efficient? Obviously, it's losing
Well,
billions of
you
dollars a
need a
year.
postal service. You need a postal service.
Oh, exactly. So, it's this is one of those things similar to the civil service reform where I talk about, hey, look what all these states have done. In socialist Europe, you have including in Germany and Britain and elsewhere, they just privatized it. It's fine. It's okay. All these things that we talk about reforms in the margin, you can just blow up a lot of this stuff
I
and
mean,
it
the
seems to
U.S.
work much
mail.
better.
If at this point, 2025, you actually need the U.S. mail for anything other than the rare certified letter, maybe, and even that, there's DocuSign, like everything you need. I mean, I don't want to get a letter for anything. If I have a bill, I don't want them to put in the mail. The lawyers seem to, be back in the 19th century. They want to serve you and all this kind of stuff. Fine, but there's no reason for the postal service at all. There's probably, no reason for a fire force, at the size it is. I mean, this is my little, I trot this out now and then, but if you look to the 1990s, number of fires, or the 80s, there were 10 times the number of actual actionable fires that there are now. People still have gas stoves and whatnot, but we have addressable panels. We have buildings built better to code. We have more space per person. We're not living on top of each other, whatever. So there are almost no fires. It's a rarity. I'm in a town of 60,000 people. We have maybe a fire every few years. But there's still exactly the number of firemen. Frankly, they're I think equal per capita number of firemen. So there are more firemen than there were then, and they make proportionally in real dollars more than they did back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So you're paying them more for a job that is not. And so all they do is they show up as quasi EMTs, and the postal workers they're going to try to morph themselves into census takers or whatever. But stop that. Like the postal service I think is the one of the maybe the largest single employer in the country. There's I think 750,000 or something like that, million employees. Like, okay, really? I mean, I get it. If you want to do that, fine. But why should we be paying for this endlessly?
Yeah, most of this is the private sector is doing it pretty well without some legal strictures. Especially that the private sector right now is not allowed to deliver from place to place into your mailbox, and there's laws, and the government can put handcuffs on you if you did that, and it's absurd. There's no need for this. And again, we this is not pie in the sky free market stuff. Countries do this, and they do it fine.
Okay, so we're kind of rounding out our time. I appreciate your efforts and coming on a kind of personal job level and family life and stuff like that. How do you deal with this? I mean, do you have kids? Do they go to public schools? Your job and employment. How do things work out at an institute, which I assume is a nonprofit and whatnot? What's the hierarchical stance there? How do you attract funds? I don't know. Tell me, how does the business world and or public world populate your kind of mental panorama?
Well, you'd have to ask someone else who knew better all what happens at Manhattan Institute and how the funds flow through there. But I rely. One of my kids at a public school, one of the kids at a Catholic school. It's really tough to compete with free, which is why that one kid is at the public school. But so I grew up in DC. The last thing I'll say here is I grew up in DC and the environs. I grew up around a lot of civil servants and people working in government and in defense and so forth. I'm not going to claim there's not a need for this, and I'm not an anarchist by any stretch of the imagination. We're always going to need the military. We're going to need someone with the roads. We're going to need someone to form some basic health stuff that can't be done in the
We need
private
the
sector.
courts. We need the courts.
Yeah, we need the courts, and so there's things that government need to do and will always have to do, and that's why we should all care about getting it more efficient. But it is amazing the number of things that everyone said a while ago the government has to do that they actually don't have to do. Stephen Goldsmith, the mayor of Indianapolis, actually had a great line. We're obviously a little dated now in the tech side of, but he said, if you can find three companies doing something in the phone book, the government should not be doing that. If
Yeah. Well,
someone does, and like this is a lot of these things, a lot of these private sector, the delivery and so forth, somebody's already doing it. So just let them do the rest of it.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. And what else? Any last words?
No, it was a pleasure being on. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You as well.